All right, welcome back to our tour through Biblical Hebrew. We're getting at something that's into brand new territory for us today. We're going to dive into the world of Hebrew verbs. Now, verbs in almost any language, even English or especially English, are pretty complicated. There's a lot of things going on, but our strategy here is going to be to build a foundation in one type of verb, these Qal Perfect verbs, and then build everything else around that. So far, we've had that approach with other items like nouns into adjectives, even syllables into nouns. We've been kind of building up some of those things, and that's going to be what we're doing here. But we're really starting again at the foundation now for the verbs. We read through a few pages for today in Ross where he overviewed the form and meaning of Qal Perfect verbs and introduced us to the concepts of the Hebrew verb in general. So we'll cover some similar territory there by looking at form, by looking at function, and then looking at translation. And then we'll finish up the rest of this chapter in our next session because I think it's really important to park on this one for a moment and make sure we have a good foundation in these perfect verbs. So why don't we have a look at some of these things? So the biggest item on our list of things to do today is to have a look at that table of Qal Perfect verbs that Ross presents for us right on that first page of our chapter. But because this content is going to be really foundational for us in not only the Qal Perfect, but other verbs that we're going to move into later on in the course and in our second semester together, I thought it'd be helpful just to pause to give a bit more background to this system of verbs that we're in, because the things that we hear about here are going to be things we keep hearing about, and having a sense of that landscape before we move into it would be a helpful thing. Now, the four items I want to at least overview before we look at our Qal Perfect are roots, verbal roots, stems, conjugation, and inflection. Now, a few of those terms we've heard before with reference to things like nouns, but here we're going to apply them to verbs. So the first thing there is roots. So far in our vocabulary list, we've touched on the idea of roots insofar as some of the words we've learned have looked like other words we've learned, and we said, well, there's a connection there because they come from the same root. In Hebrew, what we're dealing with most often is words that come from a triliteral or triconsonantal root. Some come from a biconsonantal root, but others are triconsonantal, or most are triconsonantal. And what that means is simply the root behind a family of words is comprised of three consonants. So to pick a familiar example, here's our verbal root mem, lamed, kaf. Now, if we were to point this in this way, melech, we by now should be able to recognize that as the noun meaning king. We also saw malcha, meaning queen, and that was from that same verbal root. We could also point this as malach, and that would be a verb, a Qal Perfect verb meaning to rule. Now, all of those words, queen, king, to rule, are related because they come from this verbal root, mem, lamed, kaf. So roots are very helpful for recognizing verbs, and roots are very helpful when you don't know the meaning of a verb, but you may know the meaning of the noun behind it or related to it. Then you can venture a pretty good guess of what the meaning of that verb will be. So that's what a root is. We're talking about those three consonants behind a family of words. Now, stems are a little bit different. Stems are referring to different types of verbs in the Hebrew world of verbs we're entering into. There are 7 major verbal stems. There's the Qal, which we'll work on as our foundation, the Nifal, Piel, Pual, Hifil, Hofal, and Hitpael. If you look at your textbook on page 544 to 545, there should be a table of all of these there using one example, our verb pakad. Now, at first, this looks very overwhelming. It probably is overwhelming, but the idea here is that we are going to focus on the Qal, and all of the others throughout the entire paradigm that we're going to focus on, all of these are going to build on the Qal. And in fact, some of them will be very closely related to the Qal. So for example, when we learn the Qal, we're going to find is the nifal is really just the passive of the qal. When we learn the pl, we're going to find the same thing. The pu'al is the passive. We'll also find there's relations between the hifil, the hofal, and the hitpa'el in terms of the types of actions that they express or the voice of those verbs. So for now, we'll say we have verbal roots. That's doing with the actual words. But stems are something different, and that's the different types of verbs that we find in the system to express different nuances of actions. If that's a lot to kind of wade into, it's because it is, but our focus is going to be on that qal system and using that qal system as a way of laying that foundation for us before we move forward into any of the other types of stems. Well, let's talk conjugations. We just said that there are 7 stems, and if you're looking at that table, then you can see those stems kind of running down the columns. Conjugations are the different ways that a verb can be conjugated to express different types of meaning within those stems. So a qal verb will have a perfect and an imperfect and an imperative, a adjussive, a cohortative, these different types of verbs that we'll go through. The nifal will also have those same conjugations. So will the pl, the pu'al, the whole way down the list. Those stems that we talked about will house different or these same conjugations. Now, again, this seems like a lot, but if we're building off of a pattern in the qal for our stems, then we're going to do the same thing for the conjugations. Once we know what a qal perfect looks like, then understanding how to recognize a nifal perfect will be much easier, and the meaning will be much easier to grapple with as well. So we have roots, stems, conjugations, and then lastly, inflection. One of the things you're seeing in that table is that it's broken up into conjugation stems, but also masculine, feminine for gender. And in the first person only, we have what we would call a common gender. I and we, there's no distinction between masculine and feminine there. As well as number, there are singular and plural. Thankfully, there's no dual here. That was only in that world of nouns. And then finally, we have person. We have third person, second person, and first person inflections. I wanted to just tour through all those items briefly because they're going to be things that we're going over again and again. The roots are helpful for recognition. The stem, conjugation, and inflection, those are things that are all going to be part of what it means to parse our verbs. So I thought it'd be helpful to look over that before we get too deep into the system. But all that to say, what we're going to focus on is patterns of recognition, basic meanings for translation, and then using both of those things in the domain of the qal as a reference point for understanding the other stems and other conjugations. So that's a bit of a crash course in the larger world that we're in. Why don't we move ahead and start to look at some of these Qal Perfect verbs and think about translating them. All right, here we are at what's really the heart of this chapter, and again, the heart of the whole verbal system that we're just kind of warming up to. So we're going to park on this one for a little bit, and I'm going to say memorize this paradigm. We'll throw it on quizzes. We'll get it in our heads a few different ways, but get used to seeing this and to reproducing it. What we'll do today is focus on the patterns of endings, the meanings of those endings, and how they all fit within this paradigm. And we'll look at some kind of variations on reduction, pretonic and propretonic reduction that happens here. So there'll be a few old ideas coming back, but for the most part, this should be new. So why don't we walk through this paradigm? We'll observe a few things. We'll say it a few times together and get a sense of what's going on. The first thing to observe is that the paradigm, as you can see here, so just reproduce from our workbook, the paradigm is inflected for person, gender, and number. We have third, second, and first here, both sides. On this side we have our singular. On this side we have our plurals. We also have our gender, and our gender starts with the 3 MSG, the 3 FSG, 2 MS, 2 FS, and then one common singular. Remember, the first person, there is no gender. There's a common gender for both. And then when we go to the plural side, we have a third common plural here again. In the Qal Perfect, we don't have a third feminine plural. We only have a common plural. Then we have our second masculine plural, second feminine plural, and our first common plural. So we have all those forms throughout. It goes 3, 2, 1, masculine, feminine, and then all the way down from singular to plural. Now, if we start at the very top of this chart, kind of right up here, pakad. The reason why I've broken that form out for us up at the top is that this is going to be our lexical form. When we need to look up a verb, whether it's a Qal verb or way later, if it's a Hifil verb or a PL verb, what we're going to be looking up is that lexical form. So this one here is an important one to know. When we have verbs in our vocabulary list, we're going to be memorizing those verbs in their 3MS Qal form. And that's simply because all of the other verbs in this chart and through the entire Hebrew verb system are built or relate back to this. This is the most simple form. So the lexical form will always be 3MS, third masculine singular, and it will always be in the Qal Perfect. Now, before we move on from this, we could say a few things about that, about even this form. What we are seeing here is what we'll call our typical pattern for vocalization of the Qal Perfect. When you run your eyes down this paradigm, most often what you're seeing is that kametz plus a patach as the defining feature. In a minute, we'll look at a few places where that's not true, but for now, if we recognize that as being something that accounts for probably about 80-85% of the vowels in this paradigm, then we're in good shape. So 3MS looks like that, pakad, and those two hints, that kametz and a patach, will also be helpful for us as we run our eyes down it further. All right, so we've looked at one verb. We've got a sense of what's going on in these inflected columns here. The column that I've added in for us here that I don't believe was in our textbook, this one and this one, are our endings. In Hebrew, the way that we're going to recognize different types of verbs, different stems of verbs, Qal, PL, Hifil, is by their distinctive endings, suffixes, or their beginnings, the prefixes. These endings that we're learning right now are really important because they're going to signal for us that we're dealing with a Qal perfect verb, but they'll also be the same endings that we'll use to recognize perfect verbs in every other stem, PL, Hifil, whatever it may be. So we want to recognize these and memorize these. My advice would be to memorize them in the context of a word, as in memorize this part here, as well as this part, but be able to recognize those endings, that ending or that ta ending when you see them. All right, let's move on now to the actual verb. When we look at these endings, we see that basic vowel pattern, but we'll note that when we add those endings on the end of our 3MS form, pakad, we see some changes in reduction, vowel reduction throughout the paradigm. And this is localized to a few places, so I want to zero in on that, for example, with our, let's go to our second masculine plural and our second feminine plural. So we'll see if we can't get over here. All right. If the typical pattern or the usual pattern would be that kametz plus a patach, then what we're seeing here is some familiar habits. Remember propretonic reduction? If we were to break this into syllables, it would look like this. Pekad tem, pekad ten. Now, when that kametz is in that first position, and we are adding those heavy, what we'll call heavy closed syllable, those CVC endings right here, these CVC endings, tem or ten, these ones, then that's going to draw the accent so strongly that it will have the effect of reducing that vowel, and that's why we're seeing that shiva there. So there, that's getting back to something we have seen quite some time ago, but now we're applying that idea of propretonic reduction to this new world of verbs that we're in. So that's one thing to be aware of. A few other things to be aware of. Again, this is probably throwing us back to that first or even second week when we were dealing with all the signs and symbols and sounds, and we looked at accents. And one of the accents we learned was a metheg. And if it's been a while since you've remind yourself what this is. We're talking about this. Well, not all of that, I guess. It's this line here. But when that's positioned by a comets, if you remember what that's signaling for us is that it's a bit of a speed bump. It's saying don't rush this sound. That, in fact, is a comets, not a comets hatuf. And that's important for us because that's telling us you pronounce this pakeda, not pokda. So again, if we were to draw the syllables there, pakeda is how that would break down. We see that in the 3FS form. We also see it over in our third common plural form. So just so we can rough this out. This again, pakadu, pakadu. So what we're hearing is that ending. We're retaining that comets, and that metheg is telling us not to rush it and not to pronounce it as a closed syllable, but in fact it's an open syllable. So there again, that would be something that's an old idea or an old rule we're applying here. Now, one final thing we could recognize that's going on before we run through this entire paradigm is there's a few forms that we have the benefit of an accent. If you remember, the default position or the typical thing that will happen in Hebrew is we will have our accent falling. Oh, let's undo that. We'll have our accent fall on the final syllable of a word. And when that's not the case, we'll have this to help indicate that the accent is retained elsewhere. So in our 2 MSG, in our 1 CSG, and our 1 CP, our one common plural, we're going to have that accent. So that's something that's important to note as well when we're recognizing forms. So all that to say, this is foundational. Those things that we've tracked there, those changes that we've tracked are incremental changes and really getting back to things that we've already dug into, whether it's reduction, whether it's accents like the metheg or accents above characters. Those are things we've heard about before. Now we're just observing them in the context of this verb paradigm. So the most important things here are to start to get used to working through this paradigm through 3, 2, 1, the common with the singular, to be able to recognize these endings and to be able to recognize them in the context of nouns. So we'll do this together when we meet in class, but let's just read through this a few times. Starting from the top, the 3 MSG, we'll work our way down this column and then down this column. All right, so here we go. It's pakad, pakada, pakadta, pakad, pakadti. And then if we start up at the top over here, pakadu, pekadtem, pekadten, pakadnu. So that's our entire Qal Perfect paradigm. We'll work on this. I would recommend writing it out a million times, getting it in your head, saying it out loud. We'll do that together in class. But that's going to be foundational for us. We're going to need this to make sense of not just the Qal Perfect verbs, but to make sense of every other verb that we encounter because it will be based on the lessons we've learned in this system. So we've just toured through that master paradigm, and again, foundational, we'll use it to build on. One of the things that we will use that paradigm to build on is how we understand a few other types of changes that relate not to different verbal stems, like the PL, the HIPAL, the NIFAL, but that relate to changes that are occasioned by when we have a guttural letter. Hebrew wouldn't be Hebrew if we didn't learn a rule without following it by an exception. So here's some changes you want to know about, things to be aware of. But again, if we've been working on a few of these concepts earlier on, then we can apply them here. It shouldn't really be anything new, maybe just a new application. One of the ideas that we came across early in the course is that guttural letters, these gutturals and resh in that category, are very easily either scared away or they can't handle certain things, and one of the things they can't handle is a simple shava. If we remember, we looked at simple shava, compound shava. One of the ideas that we came across was that whereas our strong consonants could all take a simple shava, either silent or vocal, our gutturals can't do that. And anytime we would usually have a simple shava under a character, when it's a guttural, that'll become compound shava. So everything on this page is relating back to that rule. We're going to look at 3 examples of verbs, and these are the same ones that Ross highlights for us. And we're going to see that the changes that occur in these verbs, in this verb paradigm rather, the Qal paradigm, really only affects a few of the inflected verbs, depending on where the guttural is positioned. So let's start at the top. When we say one guttural verb, so what we're talking about is when we have a verbal root. Again, we'll go back to our kind of character holders. A one guttural verb has a guttural in that first position. When that happens, we'll see a few changes, and the changes we'll see will affect 2 verbs. The pattern that we will follow for the paradigm for the strong verbs, like we just saw a minute ago with the verb pakad, will be the same, except for the cases of the 2 masculine plural, which is this guy right here, and the 2 feminine plural. There we'll see a change in one important area, because if you remember these forms, or if you have that table open in your textbook, these forms usually would have pekad ten or pekad tem with that vocal shiva under it, because we had that propretonic reduction. Well, as we know, a guttural can't take that, and it will prefer a compound shiva. So that's the only change we're seeing here. In one guttural verbs, where we would expect to see a simple shiva, we have a compound shiva, an old rule applied in a new place. Let's look at our second example. Here we're talking about verbs, 2 guttural verbs. What that means is they have a guttural in their middle position. So for our example here, bahar, meaning to choose. This up here meant to stand, by the way. Bahar, to choose something. We have that het in the middle position. That's a 2 guttural verb. Here again, it's the same rule, because a guttural can't take a simple shiva when that would usually be the case in our master paradigm. We'll expect to see a compound shiva. And again, that only occurs in 2 places. In the 3FSG, which is this form right here, and the 3rd common plural, which is this form right here. So what we're talking about is this guy, that compound shiva under the het. The form in our strong pattern for the 3rd feminine singular was pakeda, where we had that vocal shiva in this position right here. Because we have a het, it becomes bahara with a compound shiva. And the same thing applies in this case here. Our strong paradigm verb for that was pakadu, with a vocal shiva here. But because of that 2 guttural, then we see a change here to baharu. So those first 2 for 1 and 2 gutturals are really saying the same thing. It's just reminding us of that fact that gutturals can't take a simple shiva. All right, last one here is these 3 gutturals. So this should be no surprise. Here we are talking about verbs that have a guttural in this 3rd position. That's what we mean. Shama'at. This one is a bit interesting, and we'll just call this an anomaly. Verbs with a 3rd root letter that's a guttural, like this one, will follow the regular pattern of verbs. They'll follow the regular typical pattern like we had with pakad, except for this case in the 2FSG. And the only difference there is that where we would usually have in this position, try that again. In that position, we would usually have a shiva. Here we get a patak. In the cases here, we're going for a compound shiva, but for some reason or another, which is we'll just say is above our pay grade, this becomes a patak. Again, focus on what doesn't change. If you know that entire paradigm and you know that old rule of why a shiva can't take, or why a guttural can't take a simple shiva, then there's really nothing to worry about. Know the paradigm, revisit some of those old rules, focus on the endings, and don't be thrown off by some of these changes that might show up if a guttural is in the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd position. All right, well, let's finish off with a word on translation values and the basic meaning that we'll associate with this Qal Perfect. In probably the simplest terms, the Qal Perfect denotes a simple and completed action. These two items are, in my mind, probably the most important thing for understanding what is going on with the Qal: simple and completed action. And when I say complete, I mean that action is complete in the mind of the writer who's presenting this sentence or the story that you're reading. Now, that action may technically be past, present, or future. The big one that we'll see is our simple translations will probably fall under this category here, past or present. Future we'll see, but not quite as often. But the big idea, again, is it's completed. It's not ongoing. We're going to meet an entire different set of verbs that give us ongoing action. The Qal Perfect is simple. It's completed action. I like the analogy of taking a picture to kind of illustrate this. Even if there's a larger scene that you're watching, say you're at a football game or something, and you take a picture of something that happens, like a touchdown, you've captured a simple, complete action. Even though the game kept going, it was ongoing, you've captured a verbal action in a way that's simple now. It's past, it's complete. So you would say, he scored a touchdown, not he is scoring a touchdown, for example. The picture you take would indicate that simple, completed action. That's what we're talking about with the Qal Perfect verbs. Now, if that's an analogy, that's great, but for translating this, what are some of the options you're going to entertain? And here's where we can kind of focus down on this section of the page. Ross went through some examples for us. We're going to kind of review some of those and add one more here. We can express that completed action in really one of 3 or 4 ways, depending on the time aspect. Most often, we'll use the simple past, this one right here. Let's say that this will be our default position for translating the Qal Perfect. Simple past completed action. He studied in our example. The action took place in the past. It was a singular event. It's over. That one we'll use as our default unless the context of a verse or passage indicates otherwise. Having said that, we can see a few other options, or entertain a few other options in translating. One of them would be what we could call the present perfect. That is when the action is complete, but it is also expressing a present reality. He has studied would be an example of what that looks like in the present perfect. So the studying is complete, but it's something that's impacting the present. He has studied. In a few cases, we may also see the use of a future perfect. In this way, it's looking ahead to an event that is not yet materialized, but when it does, the action will be a completed event. So to kind of carry on with our example, we could say he will have studied. When he studies in the future, he will do it for a defined amount of time, and it will be complete, and it will be over, but it hasn't yet occurred. That one we see less of in Hebrew, but it's something to be aware of. Now, the final item we could add to this list, even though it's not here, relates to what are called stative verbs. And these are verbs that in the Qal Perfect describe a state of being rather than a state of action. So to give you a few examples, the verb to be heavy, kaved, to be heavy, is not describing an action but a state of being. The same thing we could use other verbs like to be small or to be little or to be light. There's verbs in Hebrew that express those states, but they're not expressing an action. That's a few things that fall into this category. For our job today, let's say simple past is the most common. That'll be our default. Present perfect in second place, let's say, and the future perfect, he will have studied, that type of thing. Less common, but something to be aware of. So the main thing I'm hoping for us out of all this is to really invest in this Qal Perfect paradigm. This is going to be the one that's under the hood of almost every other verb we deal with. Start to get used to recognizing verbal roots and then paying attention to things like those suffixes to help us parse verb for the inflected person, gender, number, and then to use those things as a guide for translating a verb and then translating those most often as our simple past, that simple completed action. So that's our tour through the Qal verb system. There's a lot going on in there. This is our first kind of brand new thing in a while. But why don't we take the time to get our head into this, and we'll find out that it helps us later on.